Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my beautiful hot messes. My name is Mistress Lavender, and I'm on chapter 5 of The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson. The chapter is You Are Always Choosing, page 98, and I'm continuing where we left off. If you don't know what I'm talking about, who I even am, click the first video and don't be silly. But are you ready? For example, if you woke up one day and there was a newborn baby on your doorstep, it would not be your fault that the baby was had been put there, but the baby would now be your responsibility. You would have to choose what to do, and whatever you end up choosing, keeping it, getting rid of it, ignoring it, feeding it to a pit bull, there would be there would be problems associated with your choice, and you will be responsible for those as well. Judges don't get to choose their cases. When a case goes to court, the judge assigned to it did not commit the crime, was not a witness to the crime, and was not affected by the crime. But he or she or they is still responsible for the crime. The judge must then choose the consequences. He or she must identify the metric against which the crime will be measured and make sure that the chosen metric is carried out. We are responsible for experiences that aren't our fault all the time. This is a part of life. Here's one way to think about the distinction between the two concepts. Fault is past tense, responsibility is present tense. Fault results from choices that have already been made. Responsibility results from the choices you're currently making every second of every day. You are choosing to read this. You are choosing to think about the concepts. You are choosing to accept or reject the concepts, but you are responsible for coming to your own conclusions. It's not your fault that I chose to write this sentence, but you are still responsible for choosing to read it or not. There's a difference between blaming someone else for your situation and that person's actually being responsible for your situation. Nobody else is responsible for your situation but you. Many people may be to blame for your situation. Many people many people may be to blame for your unhappiness, but nobody is ever responsible for your unhappiness but you. This is because you always get to choose how you see things, how you react to things, how you value things. You always get to choose the metric by which to measure your experiences. My first girlfriend dumped me in a spectacular fashion. She was cheating on me with her teacher. It was awesome. And by awesome, I mean it felt like getting punched in the stomach about 253 times. To make things worse, when I confronted her about it, she promptly left me for him. 3 years together down the toilet just like that. I was miserable for months afterward. That was to be expected. But I also held her responsible for my misery, which, take it from me, didn't get me very far. It just made the misery worse. See, I couldn't control her. No matter how many times I called her or screamed at her or begged her to take me back or made surprise visits to her place or did other creepy and irrational ex boyfriend things, I could never control her emotions and her actions. Ultimately, while she was to blame for how I felt, she was never responsible for how I felt. I was. At some point, after enough tears and alcohol, my thinking began to shift, and I began to understand that although she had done something horrible to me, and she could be blamed for that, it was now my responsibility to make myself happy again. She was never going to pop up and fix things for me. I had to fix them for myself. When I took that approach, a few things happened. First, I began to improve myself. I started exercising and spending more time with my friends who I had been neglecting. I started deliberately meeting new people. I took a big study abroad trip and did some volunteer work. And slowly I started to feel better. I still resented my ex for what she had done, but at least now I'm taking responsibility for my own emotions. And by doing so, I was choosing better values. Values aimed at taking care of myself, learning to better myself, rather than rather than aimed at getting her to fix what she'd broken. By the way, this whole holding her responsible for my emotions thing is probably why she left in the first place. More on that in a couple of chapters. Then, about a year later, something funny began to happen. As I looked back on our relationship, I started to notice things I had never noticed before, problems that I was to blame for and that I could have done something to solve. I realized that it was likely that I hadn't been a great boyfriend, and that people don't magically cheat on somebody they've been with unless they are unhappy for some reason. I'm not saying that to excuse what my ex did, not at all. But recognizing my mistakes helped me realize that I perhaps haven't been the innocent victim I believed myself to be. That I had a role to play in enabling the SC relationship to continue for as long as it did. After all, people who date each other tend to have similar values. And if I dated someone with SE values for that long, what did that say about me and my values? Ooh. I learned that the hard way that if the people in your relationships are selfish and doing hurtful things, it's likely you are too. You just don't realize it. In hindsight, I was able to look back and see warning signs of my ex girlfriend's characters, signs I had chosen to ignore or brush off when I was with her. That was my fault. I could look back and see that I hadn't exactly been the boyfriend of the year to her either. In fact, I had often been cold and arrogant towards her. Other times I took her for granted or and blew her off and hurt her. These things were my fault too. Did my mistakes justify her mistake? No. But still, I took on the responsibility of never making those same mistakes again and never overlooking the same signs again to help guarantee that I will never suffer the same consequences again. I took on the responsibility of striving to make my future relationships with women much better. And I'm happy to report that I have. No more cheating girlfriends leaving me. No more 253 stomach punches. I took no more 53 stomach punches. I took responsibility for my problems and I improved upon them. I took responsibility for my role in that unhealthy relationship and improved upon it with later relationships. And you know what? My ex leaving me, while one of the most painful experiences I've ever had, was also one of the most important and influential experiences of my life. I credit it with inspiring a significant amount of personal growth. I learned more from that single problem than dozens of my successes combined. We all love to take responsibility for success and happiness. Heck, we often fight over who gets to be responsible for success and happiness. But taking responsibility for our problems is far more important because that's where the real learning comes from. That's where the real life improvement comes from. To simply blame others is to only hurt yourself. Responding to tragedy, but responding to tragedy. But what about really awful events? A lot of people can get on board with taking responsibility for work-related problems or maybe watching too much TV when they should really be playing with their kids or being productive. But when it comes to horrible tragedies, they pull the emergency cord on the responsibility train and get off when it stops. Some things just feel too painful for them to own up to. But think about it, the intensity of the event doesn't change the underlying truth. If you get robbed, say you're obviously not at fault for being robbed. No one would ever choose to go through that. But as with the baby on your doorstep, you are immediately thrust into responsibility for a life and death situation. Do you fight back? Do you panic? Do you freeze up? Do you tell the police? Do you try to forget it never happened? These are all choices and reactions you're responsible for making or rejecting. You didn't choose the robbery, but it's still your responsibility to manage the emotional and psychological and legal fallout of the experience. In 2008, the Taliban took control of the Swat Valley, a remote part of northeastern Pakistan. They quickly implemented their Muslim extremist agenda. No television, no films, no women outside the house without a male escort, no girls attending school. By 2009, an 11-year-old Pakistani girl named Malala Yousafzai had begun to speak out against the school ban. She continued to attend her local school, risking both her and her father's lives. She also attended conferences in nearby cities. She wrote online, "How dare the Taliban take away my right for education?" In 2012, at the age of 14, she was shot in the face as she rode the bus home from school one day. A masked Taliban soldier, armed with a rifle, boarded the bus and asked, "Who is Malala? Tell me, or I will shoot everyone here." Malala identified herself, an amazing choice in and of itself, and the man shot her in the head in front of all the other passengers. Malala went into a coma and almost died. The Taliban stated publicly that if she somehow survived the attempt, they would kill both her and her father. Today, Malala is still alive. She still speaks out against violence and oppression towards women in Muslim countries, now as a best selling author. In 2014, she received the Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts. It would seem that being shot in the face only gave her a larger audience and more courage than before. It would have been easy for her to lie down and say, "I can't do anything or have no choice." That, ironically, would still have been her choice, but she chose the opposite. A few years ago, I written some of the ideas in this chapter on my blog, and a man left a comment. He said that I was shallow and superficial, adding that I had no real understanding of life's problems and human responsibility. He said that his son recently died in a car accident. He accused me of not knowing what true pain was and said that I was an a-hole for suggesting that he was responsible for the pain he felt over his son's death. This man had obviously suffered pain much greater than most people ever have to confront in their lives. He didn't choose for his son to die, nor was it his fault that his son died. The responsibility for coping with that loss was given to him, even though it was clearly and understandably unwanted. But despite all that, he was still responsible for his own emotions, beliefs, and actions. How he reacted to his son's death was his own choice. Pain of one sort and another is inevitable for all of us, but we get to choose what it means to and for us. Even in claiming that he had no choice in the matter and simply wanted his son back, he was making a choice, one of many ways he could have chosen to use that pain. Of course, I didn't say any of this to him. I was too busy being horrified and thinking that, yes, perhaps I was way in over my head and had no idea what the F I was talking about. There's a hazard that comes from my that's a hazard that comes from my line of work. A problem that I chose, and a problem that I was responsible for dealing with. At first I felt awful, but then, a few minutes, I began to get angry. His objections had little to do with what I was actually saying. I told myself, and what the heck? Just because I don't have a kid who died doesn't mean I haven't experienced terrible pain myself. But then I actually applied my own advice. I chose my problem. I could get mad at this man and argue with him, try to outpain him with my own pain, which would just make us both look stupid and insensitive. Or I could choose a better problem, working on practicing patience, understanding my readers better, and keeping that man in mind every time I wrote about pain and trauma from then on. And that's what I tried to do. I replied simply that I was sorry for his loss and left it at that. What else can you say? Genetics and the hand were dealt. In 2013, the BBC rounded up dozens of teenagers with obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD, and followed them as they attended intensive therapies that would help them overcome their unwanted thoughts and repetitive behaviors. There is Imogen, a 17-year-old girl who had a compulsive need to tap every surface she walked past. If she failed to do so, flooded she was flooded with horrible thoughts of her family dying. There was Josh, who needed to do everything with both sides of his body: shake a person's hand with his right and his left hand, eat his food with each hand, step through a doorway with both his feet, and so on. If he didn't equalize his two sides, he suffered from severe panic attacks. And then there was Jack, a classic germaphobe who refused to leave his house without wearing gloves, boiled all his water before drinking it, and refused to eat food not cleaned or prepared himself. OCD is a terrible neurological and generic disorder that can't be cured. At best, it can be managed. And as well, and as we'll see, managing the disorder comes down to managing one's values. The first thing the psychiatrists on this project do is tell the children that they're to accept the imperfections of their compulsive desires. What that means, as one example, is that when Imogen becomes flooded with horrible thoughts of her family dying, she is to accept that her family may actually die and that there's nothing she can do about it. Simply put, she is told that when that happens, it's not her fault. Josh is forced to accept that over the long term, equalizing all of his behaviors to make them symmetrical is actually destroying his life more than occasional panic attacks would. And Jack is reminded that no matter what he does, germs are always present and always infecting him. The goal is to get kids to recognize that their values are not rational, that the fact their values are not even theirs, but rather are the disorders. And that by fulfilling these irrational values, they are actually harming their abilities to function in life. The next step is to encourage the kids to choose a value that is more important than their OCD value and to focus on that. For example, it's a possibility for not having to hide his disorder from his friends and his family all the time. The prospect of having a normal functioning social life. For Imogen, it's the idea of taking control of her own thoughts and feelings and being happy again. And for Jack, it's the ability to leave his house for long periods of time without suffering traumatic episodes. With these new values held front and center in their minds, the teenagers set out an incentive desanitization exercise that forced them to live out their new values. Panic attacks ensue, tears are shed, Jack punches an array of inanimate objects and then immediately washes his hands. But by the end of the documentary, major progress has been made. Imogen no longer needs to tap every surface she comes across. She says there are still monsters in the back of my mind, and there always will be, but they're getting quieter now. Josh is able to go periods of 25 to 25 minutes without equalizing his behaviors between both sides of his body. And Jack, who makes perhaps the most improvement, is actually able to go out to restaurants and drink out of bottles and glasses without washing them first. Jack sums up well what he learned. I didn't choose this life. I didn't choose this horrible, horrible condition, but I get to choose how I live with it. I have to choose how to live with it. A lot of people treat being born with a disadvantage, whether OCD or small stature or something very different, as they were screwed out of something high valuable. They feel that there's nothing they can do about it, so they avoid responsibility for the situation. They figure, I didn't choose my crappy genetics, so it's not my fault if things go wrong. And it's true, it's not their fault, but it is their responsibility. Back in college, I had a bit of a delusional fantasy of becoming a professional poker player. I won money and everything, and it was fun. But after a year of serious play, I quit. The lifestyle of staying up all night, staring at a computer screen, winning thousands of dollars one day, and then losing most of it the next wasn't for me. And it wasn't exactly the most healthy and emotionally stable means of earning a living. But by the time, but my time playing poker had a surprisingly profound influence on how I see life. The beauty of poker is that while luck is always involved, luck doesn't dictate the long term result of the game. A person can get dealt terrible cards and beat someone who has dealt great cards. Sure, the person who gets dealt great cards has a higher likelihood of winning the hand, but ultimately the winner is determined by, yup, you guessed it, the choices each player makes throughout the play. I see life in the same terms. We all get dealt cards. Some of us get better cards than others. And while it's easy to get hung up on our cards, we feel we get screwed over. We get screwed over. The real game lies in the choices we make with those cards, the risks we decide to take, and the consequences we choose to live with. People are constantly making the best choices in their situations they're given, are the ones who eventually outhand the poker, just as life. I messed up that sentence for the well. And it's not necessarily the people with the best cards. There are those who suffer psychological and emotionally from neurological and or genetic deficiencies. But this changes nothing. Sure, they inherited a bad hand and are not to blame. No more than the short guy waiting to get a date is blamed for being short, or the person who was robbed is blamed for getting robbed. But it's still their responsibility. Whether they choose to seek psychiatric treatment, undergo therapy, or do nothing, the choice is inherently theirs to make. There are those who suffer through bad childhoods. They're those who are abused and violated and screwed over physically, emotionally, and financially. They are not to blame for their problems or inherit or and their hindrances, but they are still responsible, always responsible to move on despite their problems and to make the best choices they can given their circumstances. Okay, I'm gonna stop there because once I keep on messing up, it's time to stop and drink some water. But I'm so happy you guys stuck through the whole video with me. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'm gonna start the next episode at, and let's be honest, I'm on page 109 of chapter 5. But I appreciate you, and I'll see you next video. Bye. And remember, be grateful for today. I'm so happy you exist.